In the heart of the British Columbia wilderness, a man lies bound to a tree. Steph Kowalski, a 32-year-old wildlife conservation officer. While investigating illegal logging activity in the remote forest, he was ambushed by the loggers and left tied to an ancient Douglas fir, abandoned. The loggers bound him tightly to the tree with climbing rope and disappeared into the woods. The ropes that tied his wrists and ankles, impossible to break. He screamed, "Someone! Anyone!" calling for help. But the forest was too vast and the nearest ranger station was 15 kilometers away through impossible terrain. The first night, Steph shivered violently as the temperature dropped below freezing. The second day, his lips cracked and bled from dehydration. On the morning of the third day, his consciousness began to fade. Is this the end? That's when it happened. A massive gray wolf emerged from the tree line. Standing nearly a meter tall at the shoulder, it was a magnificent apex predator, its fur thick with winter coat. Steph's heart raced wildly. Encountering a wolf in the wild is dangerous enough, but unable to move, completely helpless, this was a death sentence. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. But something was strange. The wolf didn't attack. Instead, it stopped several meters away and gazed at Steph for a long time. In those amber eyes, there was no hunger, no aggression. The wolf approached slowly, very slowly. Steph closed his eyes. This is really the end. But no attack came. When he opened his eyes, the wolf wasn't looking at Steph, but at the ropes binding him. It sniffed them carefully and suddenly began to growl. But that growl wasn't directed at Steph. It was an angry sound directed at the ropes themselves. And then Steph noticed, this wolf had a distinctive scar across its right shoulder. The unmistakable mark of a leg-hold trap. And a notched left ear, torn and healed. Suddenly, a memory from 6 months ago flooded back. The first hour, Steph believed someone would come. He'd radioed his position before approaching the logging site, standard protocol. When he didn't check in by sundown, the station would send a search team. He just had to stay calm, conserve energy, wait for rescue. The ropes cut into his wrists, but he could handle that. The cold was manageable. Everything was manageable if rescue was coming. By the third hour, doubt crept in. His radio lay 15 feet away in the underbrush where the loggers had thrown it after smashing it with a boot heel. The pieces glinted in the fading sunlight, mocking him. He'd mentioned the general area in his last transmission, but general area covered 30 square kilometers of dense forest. Finding one man tied to one tree in that vastness would be like finding a specific needle in a warehouse full of haystacks. The sun set. Temperature dropped. Steph's ranger jacket was designed for mild Pacific Northwest weather, not a stationary overnight in November. He could feel the cold seeping through the fabric, settling into his bones. His fingers started going numb around hour 5. By hour 7, he couldn't feel his toes. The forest sounds changed after dark. During the day, they'd been familiar. The rustle of wind through Douglas fir needles, the distant call of a raven, the scurrying of squirrels in the canopy. Sounds he'd heard 1,000 times on patrol. Sounds that meant home. But night transformed everything. That rustle became something moving through undergrowth with purpose. That distant call became a predator signaling to its pack. That scurrying became claws on bark, something climbing, something hunting. Steph's mind knew the difference between imagination and reality. His body didn't care. He started shivering around midnight. Violent, uncontrollable tremors that made the ropes soar deeper into his wrists. He could feel blood, warm at first, then cold, trickling down his hands. The pain was sharp and immediate, cutting through the numbness. Good, he thought. Pain means I'm still alive. The second day brought a different kind of suffering. The shivering stopped, which Steph knew was worse than the shivering continuing. His body was giving up on generating heat, conserving what little energy remained for vital organs. His thoughts became sluggish, words in his mind arriving seconds late, incomplete. Thirst became everything. His tongue felt thick and foreign in his mouth, his throat raw from screaming for help during the night. He'd stopped screaming around dawn when he realized he was just wasting moisture, just making the dehydration worse. The sounds of the forest weren't frightening anymore. They were just sounds. Background noise to the roaring in his ears, the pounding of his heart working too hard to push blood through constricting vessels. He thought about his sister in Vancouver, about the argument they'd had last Christmas, something stupid about their mother's estate. He'd meant to call her, meant to apologize. Now she'd get a different kind of call. He thought about the wolf he'd saved 6 months ago, how it had limped away into the trees without looking back. He'd wondered at the time if the animal would survive, if the antibiotics would be enough to prevent infection in the wilderness. Probably not, he'd decided. Nature was beautiful, but it was also brutally efficient. The weak died. The injured died. The strong survived. Steph wasn't feeling very strong. The second night was worse than the first. His body had stopped shivering entirely now, which meant core temperature was dropping into the danger zone. Hypothermia was setting in properly. Not the mild stage where you shook and your teeth chattered, but the moderate stage where your brain started shutting down non-essential functions. Like hope. Like rational thought. Like the will to keep fighting. He drifted in and out of consciousness, dreams bleeding into reality until he couldn't tell which was which. In one dream, Emma was 6 again, drawing pictures at the kitchen table. In another, the wolf was back, watching him with those knowing eyes. When he woke, if he woke, the forest was gray with pre-dawn light. His vision was blurred, his hearing muffled. Everything felt distant, like he was watching his own death from underwater. The third day. This would be the last day. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His fingers had gone from numb to painful to numb again, never a good sign. His legs, bound at the ankles, had lost all sensation below the knee. Steph tried to remember why he'd become a conservation officer. Something about protecting the wilderness, about keeping it pure and untouched. The irony wasn't lost on him. The wilderness he'd spent his career protecting was now killing him with the same indifference it showed to every dying creature. Nature didn't care about your intentions. Nature didn't reward the good guys. Nature just was. Around mid-morning of the third day, Steph's consciousness began to fragment. Time became meaningless. He was aware of light and dark, of cold and colder, but nothing more specific than that. He didn't hear the wolf approach. Didn't see it emerge from the tree line. He only knew it was there when he opened his eyes and found himself staring into amber fire. The wolf appeared without warning, materializing from the shadows like something conjured from Steph's deteriorating mind. One moment the forest was empty, the next moment it was there, a massive gray shape standing at the edge of the clearing, utterly still. Steph's heart, which had been beating sluggishly for hours, suddenly hammered against his ribs with primal terror. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something other than hang here like meat on a hook. He couldn't do any of those things. The wolf was enormous, easily 130 pounds of muscle and predatory intelligence. Its winter coat was thick, gray and silver with darker markings along the spine. Even through his blurred vision, Steph could see the power in its shoulders, the deliberate way it placed each paw. This was an alpha, a survivor, a killer. And Steph was completely helpless. The wolf's head turned toward him with unsettling precision, as if it had known exactly where he was all along and had simply been deciding whether to acknowledge his presence. Amber eyes caught the fading light, reflecting it back with an otherworldly glow. Steph tried to make himself smaller, an absurd instinct given that he was literally tied to a tree. His breathing came in short, panicked gasps that created small clouds of vapor in the cold air. Each exhale was a signal, a beacon advertising wounded prey. The wolf began to move. Not rushing, not stalking, just walking with the confidence of something that had no natural enemies. It circled to the left, keeping perhaps 20 feet of distance, its gaze never leaving Steph's face. "Stay back," Steph heard himself whisper, his voice cracked and raw. "Please. Stay back." The wolf's ears swiveled toward the sound, but it didn't stop moving. It completed a quarter circle, then paused. Its nose lifted slightly, testing the air. Steph could see its nostrils flaring, could imagine what it smelled: blood from his rope-burned wrists, the sour stench of fierce sweat, the chemical signature of a body beginning to shut down. The smell of dying. Wolves didn't typically attack healthy adult humans. Steph knew this. He'd given presentations on wolf behavior, had reassured countless terrified hikers that their chances of being attacked were statistically negligible. Wolves avoided human contact, preferred natural prey, posed minimal threat. But he wasn't a healthy adult right now. He was wounded, immobilized, hypothermic. In the wolf's eyes, he wasn't a human anymore. He was prey. The wolf resumed its circling. It moved to Steph's right, then behind the tree where he couldn't see it. The not knowing was worse than the watching. Steph's imagination filled the blind spot with teeth and lunging muscle. He strained against the ropes, trying to turn his head far enough to see, but the bark bit into his cheek and he couldn't get the angle. Silence. Just the whisper of wind through the canopy and his own ragged breathing. Then the wolf reappeared on his left, completing the full circuit. It had closed the distance. Now only 10 feet separated them. Close enough that Steph could see the individual guard hairs in its coat, could see the old scars that marked its muzzle and shoulders. Close enough to kill. But the wolf didn't attack. It sat down. The movement was so casual, so utterly non-threatening, that it took Steph's fear-addled brain several seconds to process what he was seeing. The wolf had simply lowered its haunches to the forest floor and sat there, tail curled around its front paws, watching him with those unblinking amber eyes. Steph's panic didn't diminish. If anything, the strangeness of the behavior intensified his terror. He understood predation. He understood the food chain. But this eerie patience, this focused attention that felt almost like evaluation? This he didn't understand at all. "What do you want?" he whispered. The wolf's ears twitched. It tilted its head slightly, a gesture so dog-like that it created a jarring cognitive dissonance. This wasn't a dog. This was a wild predator that had probably never seen a human up close, that had no reason to show anything but fear or aggression. Yet it just sat there, watching. Minutes passed. The light continued to fade. Steph's shivering returned with renewed violence, his body's desperate attempt to generate warmth in the deepening cold. The movement should have triggered a prey response in the wolf. Injured animals shook and trembled before they died. The wolf didn't move. It stayed there as darkness fell completely, a gray ghost in the shadows. Steph could still see its eyes, those amber embers floating in the black. Watching. Always watching. At some point during the night, exhaustion overrode terror. Steph's consciousness began to drift, his chin dropping to his chest. He fought to stay awake. Falling asleep with a predator this close was suicide, but his body had reached its limits. When his eyes finally closed, the last thing he saw was those amber eyes, steady and unwavering in the darkness. When he woke, hours later, or maybe just minutes, time had lost all meaning. The wolf was still there. It had moved closer during the night, close enough now that Steph could have touched it if his hands were free. It lay on the ground, head resting on its paws, but its eyes were open. Still watching. Still waiting. The sun began to rise, painting the forest in shades of gray and gold. The wolf stood, shook itself once, and for a terrible moment Steph thought it was leaving, thought it had kept vigil all night only to abandon him now. But it didn't leave. Instead, it moved even closer, approaching with slow, deliberate steps until it stood directly in front of Steph, near enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from its body. Near enough that he could see the distinctive scar across its right shoulder. And that's when everything changed. The wolf's breath came in visible puffs against Steph's face, warm and rank with the smell of recent kill. This close, Steph could see everything. The yellow of ancient canine teeth, the dark rim around each amber iris, the slight twitch of whiskers sensing the air between them. This was it. The end. Steph had imagined his death 100 different ways over the past 3 days. Freezing to death in the night. Dehydration shutting down his organs one by one. Even the loggers returning to finish what they'd started. But being killed by a wolf while tied to a tree? That particular nightmare hadn't made the list. He found himself strangely calm. Maybe the hypothermia had progressed far enough to dull his fear response. Maybe he was simply too exhausted to be terrified anymore. Or maybe there was something almost merciful about this. Quick and brutal instead of the slow withering he'd been enduring. "Make it fast," Steph whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "Please." The wolf's ears flicked forward at the sound. It lowered its massive head, and Steph closed his eyes, every muscle in his body tensing for the bite that would end everything. The wolf's nose pressed against his throat. Cold, wet, searingly alive against his frozen skin. Steph could feel his pulse hammering beneath that gentle pressure, could feel the wolf inhaling his scent in deep, measured breaths. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then the wolf moved, but not to his throat. It pulled back and lowered its head to the ropes binding Steph's chest to the tree. The black nose traced along the climbing rope, following it from Steph's sternum around to where it wrapped behind the trunk. The wolf began to growl. The sound started low in its chest, building in intensity until Steph could feel it vibrating through the tree bark against his back. But it wasn't the growl of a predator about to strike. It was something else entirely, something that sounded almost like anger, like frustration directed not at Steph but at the ropes themselves. Steph's eyes snapped open. "What are you?" The wolf's jaws opened and closed around the rope at chest level. Its teeth, built to tear flesh and crush bone, bit down on the nylon with determined precision. The growling intensified as the wolf began to work its head back and forth, soaring through the fibers. Steph's breath stopped. He couldn't process what he was seeing. Wolves didn't do this. Wolves didn't help humans. Wolves didn't gnaw through bindings like some kind of wilderness rescue team. But this one did. The sound of teeth on rope filled the frozen morning air, a grinding, tearing sound punctuated by the wolf's continuous low growl. Steph could see the massive muscles in its neck and shoulders working, could see individual strands of the climbing rope beginning to fray and split. You're cutting me loose," Steph breathed, his mind struggling to accept the impossible reality unfolding before him. The wolf didn't pause, didn't acknowledge the words. It just kept working with single-minded determination. First rope. Second rope. The one across his chest gave way with a sharp crack like a gunshot, and Steph's torso lurched forward, no longer supported by the binding. Pain exploded through his shoulders and back as muscles that had been frozen in place for 3 days suddenly shifted. Steph gasped, tried to cry out, but his voice emerged as nothing more than a wheeze. The wolf moved immediately to his wrists. The ropes there were tighter, had cut deeper, were slick with dried blood. The wolf's approach was more careful here, its teeth working around Steph's swollen hands, avoiding the exposed flesh. Minutes passed. The wolf's breathing grew heavier, white vapor streaming from its nostrils in the cold air. But it didn't stop. Didn't rest. The left wrist binding snapped. Steph's arm dropped like dead weight, and he realized with distant horror that he couldn't feel anything below the elbow. No pain. No sensation at all. Just absence. The wolf moved to the right wrist. More grinding. More soaring. More impossible rescue from an impossible savior. When that rope parted, Steph's full weight sagged forward. Only the bindings at his ankles kept him upright now, and the wolf was already moving down, already attacking those final restraints with the same relentless focus. "Why?" Steph managed to whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The wolf paused, just for a heartbeat, and looked up at him. Those amber eyes held something that Steph's rational mind insisted couldn't be there. Recognition. Memory. Purpose. Then it returned to the ropes. The ankle bindings were thicker, designed to support a climber's full weight. The wolf worked at them for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, its teeth scraping against the tree bark, its breath coming in harsh pants now. The rope frayed, weakened, split. When the final strand gave way, Steph collapsed forward like a puppet with cut strings. He had no control over the fall, no ability to catch himself. His body simply folded and dropped, hitting the frozen ground with an impact that should have hurt but registered only as distant pressure. He lay there in the dirt and old pine needles, his limbs sprawled at unnatural angles, his breathing shallow and rapid. The world spun above him, canopy and sky trading places, reality tilting on an axis his brain could no longer track. Through the chaos of his vision, he saw the wolf standing over him. Not threatening, not aggressive, just standing there with blood on its muzzle, Steph's blood, from where the ropes had cut into his wrists, and something in its expression that looked absurdly like concern. The wolf nudged him with its nose. Gentle at first, then more insistent, pushing against Steph's shoulder as if trying to get him to stand. "Can't," Steph mumbled. His tongue felt thick, his words slurred. "Can't move. Sorry. So sorry." The wolf nudged him again, harder this time. Then it did something that shattered what remained of Steph's understanding of the natural world. It positioned itself alongside Steph's body and lowered itself to the ground, pressing its warm bulk against Steph's frozen side. The heat radiating from the wolf's body was like fire against ice, painful in its intensity but desperately needed. Steph felt tears freezing on his cheeks. He didn't understand any of this. Didn't understand why a wild predator was trying to save him, was sharing its warmth, was refusing to leave him to die alone in the forest. But as consciousness began to slip away again, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. He knew this wolf. Somehow, impossibly, he knew this wolf. The scent triggered it, musk and pine and something deeper, something wild that Steph's hindbrain recognized even if his conscious mind had forgotten. As the wolf's warmth seeped into his frozen body, memory crashed over him like a wave, pulling him 6 months into the past. Late spring. The forest green and alive instead of gray and dying. Steph had been conducting a routine patrol of the northern sector, checking for signs of the illegal trap lines that occasionally appeared despite the heavy fines and criminal charges. The poachers who set them didn't care about regulations, didn't care that leg-hold traps were banned in British Columbia for exactly this reason. He'd heard the howling from half a kilometer away, a sound of pure agony that made his blood run cold. Not the hunting calls he sometimes heard at dusk, not the territorial warnings that echoed through the valleys. This was the sound of an animal in torment. Steph had run toward it, crashing through underbrush, following the cries to a small clearing where he'd found the wolf. It had been caught for at least a day, maybe longer. The steel jaws of the trap had closed around its right front leg just above the paw, the serrated edges biting deep into muscle and tendon. The ground around the trap was torn and bloody where the wolf had tried to dig itself free, had twisted and pulled until it had nearly torn its own leg off. When the wolf saw Steph, it had tried to lunge despite its injury, had snarled and snapped with such ferocity that Steph had stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the tranquilizer gun on his belt. Protocol was clear. Call for backup. Wait for the wildlife veterinary team. Approach only when proper sedation and restraint equipment was available. A terrified, injured wolf was among the most dangerous animals you could encounter, driven by pain and fear into a state where it would attack anything that came near. But Steph had looked at that wolf and seen something beyond the snarling jaws and wild eyes. He'd seen the reality of what would happen if he followed protocol. The vet team was 3 hours away. The wolf's leg was already compromised. Infection would be setting in, blood loss weakening it by the minute. 3 hours might as well be 3 days. The wolf would die or lose the leg. Probably both. So Steph had made a choice. He'd used the tranquilizer gun, had waited the agonizing 15 minutes for the sedative to take effect while the wolf fought against the chemicals flooding its system, fought to stay conscious and dangerous because unconsciousness meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant death. When the wolf finally collapsed, Steph had approached with a racing heart and trembling hands. He'd never worked on a wolf before. Had trained on domestic dogs, had studied wild canid anatomy in textbooks, but this was different. This was 130 pounds of apex predator that would wake up furious and terrified. The trap had been old and rusted, the release mechanism stiff from disuse. Steph had worked at it for 20 minutes, his fingers slippery with the wolf's blood, before the jaws finally opened with a grinding screech of metal. The leg was devastated. Deep lacerations, exposed muscle, possible fractures. Steph had cleaned the wound as best he could with the field kit from his pack, had packed it with antibiotic powder, had wrapped it in gauze that would probably fall off within hours. It wasn't enough. He'd known it wasn't enough. But it was all he had. The wolf had started to wake while Steph was finishing the wrapping. He'd felt it stir beneath his hands, had seen the muscles beginning to twitch as consciousness returned. He'd backed away quickly, had put 20 feet of distance between himself and the animal before it fully came around. The wolf had lurched to its feet, stumbling on the injured leg, eyes unfocused and wild. For a moment it had just stood there, swaying, trying to understand what had happened. Then its gaze had found Steph. They'd locked eyes across that clearing, man and predator, rescuer and rescued. Steph had held perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting to see if the wolf would attack or flee. It had done neither. Instead, it had stood there for what felt like an eternity, just looking at him. And in those amber eyes, Steph had seen something he'd never seen in a wild animal before. Not gratitude, that was too human a concept. But recognition. Awareness that this human had caused pain but had also ended it, had been a threat but had chosen to be something else. Then the wolf had turned and limped away into the forest, favoring the injured leg heavily but moving with determination. It hadn't looked back. Steph had filed his report, had marked the location of the illegal trap, had followed up with the enforcement team that removed 6 more traps from the area. He'd never mentioned using the tranquilizer gun alone, never mentioned approaching an injured wolf without backup. And he'd never expected to see that wolf again. Now, lying in the dirt with that same animal pressed against his side, Steph understood. The scar across the right shoulder, that was where the trap had bitten deepest. The notched left ear, that had been there too, an old wound from some previous battle. This wasn't a random wolf that had happened upon a dying human. This was the wolf he'd saved. And it had come to return the favor. "You remembered," Steph whispered, his voice breaking. "You actually remembered." The wolf shifted against him, its body heat a steady presence fighting back the cold that had settled into Steph's bones. In the rising daylight, Steph could see the wolf's leg, healed now, functional, bearing weight without the limp he'd seen 6 months ago. His field medicine had been enough after all. Against all odds, this wolf had survived its injury, had healed in the wild, had continued to hunt and live and thrive in the forest. And when it had found Steph's scent on the wind, had tracked him to this clearing, had discovered him bound and dying, it had chosen to help. The debt had been paid. The ledger balanced. But as Steph lay there, feeling strength slowly returning to his frozen limbs, he realized something profound. This wasn't just about debt. This was about something deeper than simple reciprocity, something that transcended the boundaries he'd drawn between human and wild. This was about connection. About the moment when 2 living beings recognized each other not as human and animal, not as civilized and savage, but simply as survivors who had chosen compassion over indifference. The wolf nudged him again, more insistent now. Get up. Move. Survive. And this time, impossible as it seemed, Steph found the strength to try. Standing took everything Steph had. His legs trembled violently beneath him, muscles screaming from 3 days of immobility and hypothermia. He made it halfway upright before his knees buckled and he collapsed back to the frozen ground. The wolf was there immediately, pressing against his side, providing a warm solid surface to brace against. Steph gripped the thick fur at the wolf's shoulders, an act that should have gotten him bitten, should have triggered every defensive instinct in a wild animal, and pulled himself up again. This time he stayed vertical. Barely. The world tilted dangerously, his vision narrowing to a tunnel edged with darkness. Steph locked his knees and focused on breathing, on staying conscious, on not falling again because he wasn't sure he'd have the strength to get up a 3rd time. The wolf waited with infinite patience, its body a steady anchor against Steph's swaying weight. When Steph finally managed a shaky step forward, the wolf moved with him, matching his pace exactly, providing support when he stumbled. "Ranger station," Steph mumbled, his words slurred. 15 kilometers. Maybe 20. Can't make it that far." The wolf nudged him forward anyway. One step. Then another. The rhythm was agonizing. Shuffle, pause, breathe, shuffle again. Progress measured in meters instead of kilometers. Each one a small victory against the body that wanted nothing more than to lie down and surrender. The sun climbed higher, providing light but little warmth. Steph's wet clothes had frozen to his skin during the night, creating an armor of ice that cracked with each movement. His hands were useless, the fingers curled into claws that wouldn't straighten. His feet were numb blocks that he couldn't feel hitting the ground. But he kept moving. Because the wolf kept moving, kept guiding him through the forest with unerring direction, kept refusing to let him stop. They'd covered maybe 3 kilometers when Steph heard the yipping. High-pitched and eager, coming from multiple directions. His heart sank. Coyotes. The wolf heard them too. It stopped abruptly, its body going rigid beneath Steph's hand. A low growl built in its chest, different from the frustrated sound it had made while gnawing the ropes. This was pure warning, pure threat. Steph saw them emerge from the tree line. 5 coyotes, smaller than the wolf but working as a coordinated pack. They'd caught the scent of blood and weakness, had followed it to what should have been an easy meal. An injured human, barely able to walk, no weapons, no fire. Prey. The largest coyote, a rangy male with gray-brown fur, took a step forward. Its eyes were fixed on Steph with predatory calculation. The wolf moved so fast that Steph nearly fell without its support. It placed itself between Steph and the coyotes, lips pulled back to expose every one of those massive canines, the growl erupting into a full-throated snarl that echoed through the trees. The message was unmistakable. "This human is mine." The lead coyote hesitated. The size difference was significant. The wolf outweighed any 2 coyotes combined, but there were 5 of them and only 1 wolf. Numbers could overcome size. The wolf took one deliberate step forward, and the sound it made was unlike anything Steph had ever heard. Not quite a bark, not quite a howl. Something primal that spoke of ancient hierarchies and boundaries written in blood. The coyotes broke. The pack scattered into the underbrush, their yipping fading as they retreated to find easier prey elsewhere. The wolf returned to Steph's side immediately, resuming its position as living crutch and guide. It didn't pause, didn't wait for thanks or acknowledgement. It simply continued forward, and Steph had no choice but to follow. Hours blurred together. The sun crossed its zenith and began its descent toward the western horizon. Steph fell twice more, each time dragging himself back to his feet with the wolf's fur as anchor. His consciousness fragmented, scenes bleeding into each other without clear boundaries. He was walking through snow, then through mud, then snow again. The trees were Douglas fir, then hemlock, then fir again. Or maybe they'd always been the same, and his brain was simply failing to process reality correctly. The wolf never wavered, never showed frustration or impatience. It simply walked, adjusted its pace when Steph slowed, stopped when he absolutely had to rest, and nudged him back into motion when the rest had gone on too long. As sunset approached, the temperature began to drop again. Steph felt it in his bones, the creeping cold that promised another night of hypothermia, another night of fighting to stay alive until morning. "Can't do another night," he whispered to the wolf. Can't survive it." The wolf looked at him with those amber eyes, and Steph would have sworn there was understanding there. Awareness that time was running out, that Steph's body had reached the absolute limit of what it could endure. The wolf's pace increased. Not by much. Steph couldn't have handled much, but enough to notice. Enough to communicate urgency. They walked into the gathering darkness, the forest closing around them like a fist. Steph's vision had narrowed to just the patch of ground in front of his feet and the solid presence of the wolf beside him. Nothing else existed. Nothing else mattered. 1 foot. Then the other. Again. Again. Somewhere ahead, invisible in the darkness, the ranger station waited. Warmth and safety and survival. But between here and there lay kilometers of wilderness, and Steph wasn't sure he had kilometers left in him. The wolf nudged him forward one more time. And Steph, because he had no other choice, because this animal had saved him and was asking him to save himself, took another step into the night. Steph saw the lights at 11:47 p.m., according to the station log that would be filed later. To him, time had ceased to exist hours ago. There was only darkness and cold and the wolf's steady presence, and then suddenly, impossibly, there was light. Warm yellow squares flickering through the trees. Electric. Human. Home. He stopped walking, his legs simply refusing to take another step. The wolf stopped with him, its breathing heavy from the hours of supporting Steph's weight, guiding him through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in the dark. There, Steph whispered, raising one trembling hand to point at the lights. That's it. The ranger station sat in a clearing roughly 400 meters ahead. Steph could see the outline of the main building, the smaller shape of the equipment shed, the two vehicles parked in front. Lights blazed from every window. The search team was still there, still looking for him, still refusing to give up even though 3 days was well past the window for finding someone alive. 400 meters. The length of 4 football fields. A distance Steph could have jogged in 2 minutes under normal circumstances. Right now, it might as well have been 400 kilometers. His legs gave out completely. He didn't fall so much as fold, his body surrendering to gravity and exhaustion in equal measure. He ended up on his knees in the snow, swaying, his vision graying at the edges. The wolf moved in front of him, blocking his view of the lights. It lowered its head and pushed against Steph's chest. Not gently, not this time. Hard. Insistent. Almost angry. Get up. Move. You're too close to stop now. I can't, Steph said, and he was crying now, hot tears freezing on his cheeks. I can't. I'm sorry. I tried. I tried so hard. The wolf pushed him again, and the force of it nearly knocked Steph backwards. He caught himself on his hands, pain shooting through his damaged wrists, and looked up into those amber eyes that had watched over him for 3 days. The wolf wasn't giving up on him. Wouldn't let him give up on himself. Steph thought about all the times he'd lectured hikers about wilderness survival, about the importance of mental toughness, of pushing through discomfort, of never stopping when shelter was within reach. He'd said those words 100 times, had believed them completely. Now he understood how hollow they'd been. How easy it was to talk about perseverance when you were warm and fed and safe. But he also understood something else. He understood that this wolf had traveled however many kilometers to find him, had spent its strength freeing him, protecting him, guiding him through a night that should have killed them both. The debt had been paid kilometers ago. The wolf could have left at any point. It had stayed anyway. Steph couldn't dishonor that. Couldn't quit when this animal had refused to quit on him. He got his feet under him one more time. The wolf moved to his side immediately, pressing close, offering support. Together they began the final approach to the station. 400 meters became 300, then 200. Steph fell twice more, and twice more the wolf got him moving. His vision had tunneled to almost nothing, just the lights ahead, growing larger with agonizing slowness. 100 meters. He could see figures now, moving past the windows. Could see someone step out onto the porch, probably for a cigarette break, probably needing air after another failed day of searching. 50 meters. Close enough that if he could find his voice, if he could force his frozen lungs to produce sound, someone might hear him. He tried. Nothing came out but a wheeze. The wolf stopped. Steph took 2 more shambling steps before he realized his support was gone. He turned, confused, and saw the wolf standing at the edge of the clearing, just inside the tree line. Their eyes met one final time across the short distance. Steph wanted to say something, wanted to express gratitude that went deeper than words could reach, wanted to explain that this animal had done more than save his life. It had transformed his entire understanding of what the boundary between human and wild actually meant. But his voice was gone, and maybe words weren't necessary anyway. The wolf's tail moved once. Not quite a wag. Wolves didn't wag like domestic dogs, but something close. Acknowledgement. Farewell. Then it turned and melted back into the forest, grey fur dissolving into grey shadows, until Steph couldn't tell where the animal ended and the wilderness began. He stood there alone in the snow, swaying on legs that were seconds from giving out permanently, staring at the space where the wolf had been. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty air. Then he turned toward the lights and took the final steps on his own. He made it another 20 meters before his legs finally gave out for the last time. He went down hard, face first in the snow, and didn't have the strength to push himself back up. But it was enough. He was close enough now that when he hit the ground, someone inside heard it. Close enough that when the door banged open and voices started shouting, they could see him. Close enough that when hands grabbed him and pulled him toward warmth and safety and survival, he could let go of the consciousness he'd been clinging to for 3 days. His last coherent thought before the darkness took him was of amber eyes watching from the forest, making sure he made it home. The wolf had kept its promise. And Steph Kowalski had survived to understand what that promise meant. Steph woke in the ranger station's medical room 3 days later, his body wrapped in heated blankets, 4 lines running into both arms. The doctor, flown in from Vancouver, told him he'd been hours from multiple organ failure. Severe hypothermia, acute dehydration, the beginning stages of gangrene in 3 fingers. Another 6 hours and he would have lost the hand. Another 12 and he would have lost his life. "You're incredibly lucky," the doctor said, checking Steph's vitals with practiced efficiency. "The team said you made it to within 20 meters of the station on your own. That kind of will to survive is remarkable." Steph said nothing. He stared at the ceiling and thought about amber eyes in the darkness, about warmth pressed against his frozen body, about teeth gnawing through rope with relentless determination. Not on my own, he thought. Not even close. The search team had found the tree where he'd been tied, had documented the scene, had photographed the rope remnants scattered in the dirt, had bagged them as evidence for the criminal case against the loggers. They'd also found tracks, human footprints showing Steph's stumbling path back toward the station, intersecting regularly with another set of prints. Wolf tracks. Large ones. Following Steph's trail for over 15 kilometers. Probably drawn by the scent of blood. One of the rangers had theorized. "You're lucky it didn't attack. Wolves don't usually, but an injured human is vulnerable prey." Steph had listened to the theory and said nothing. Let them believe what they needed to believe. Let them file their reports with conventional explanations that made sense within their understanding of how the world worked. He knew better now. It took 6 weeks before Steph could return to field duty. His fingers had been saved, though 2 of them would never fully straighten again. Physical therapy restored most of his mobility, but he still moved with a slight limp on cold days when the old injuries ached. His first patrol took him back to the northern sector. Back to the clearing where he'd found the wolf in the leg-hold trap 6 months before the loggers had left him to die. The trap was long gone, removed by the enforcement team, but Steph could still see the scar in the earth where the wolf had dug and struggled. He stood there for a long time, remembering. That evening, as sunset painted the forest in shades of amber and gold, Steph sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing and waited. He didn't know if the wolf would come. Didn't know if it was even still in this territory, or if it had moved on to other hunting grounds, other parts of the vast wilderness. But he waited anyway. The light faded. Stars emerged overhead, cold and distant. The temperature dropped, though nothing like the brutal cold of that November night when he'd been tied to the tree. Steph was about to give up, about to head back to his truck, when he heard it, the soft pad of paws on forest floor, moving with the confident silence of an apex predator. The wolf emerged from the shadows like a ghost made solid. It looked healthy, its coat thick with winter growth, its movements fluid and strong. The scar on its right shoulder was visible in the moonlight, as was the notched left ear. They regarded each other across the clearing, man and predator, savior and saved. The roles they'd played had reversed and reversed again until the distinction became meaningless. Steph slowly reached into his pack and pulled out a sealed package of venison, premium cuts from the butcher in town, bought with his own money, carried into the wilderness for exactly this moment. He opened the package and placed it on the ground, then backed away 20 feet. The wolf approached cautiously, testing the air, assessing for threats. When it reached the meat, it looked at Steph one more time, a long, measuring gaze that seemed to contain entire conversations. Then it picked up the venison and carried it back toward the tree line. Before it disappeared, it paused at the edge of the forest, looked back. And in that final glance, Steph saw everything he needed to understand. The debt was paid. The ledger balanced. But what remained between them wasn't obligation. It was something deeper and more enduring. A recognition that transcended species, that existed in the space between wild and tame, that proved the boundaries Steph had spent his career defending were artificial constructs. The wilderness wasn't separate from humanity. It was interwoven with it through threads of compassion and reciprocity, through moments when one living being chose to save another not because of duty or instinct but because of something that might as well be called kindness. The wolf disappeared into the darkness, and Steph stood alone in the clearing with tears on his face. He returned to his truck and drove back to the station, but something fundamental had shifted in how he understood his work. He wasn't protecting the wilderness from humanity anymore. He was protecting the possibility of connection, the rare, precious moments when the barrier between human and wild dissolved and two beings saw each other clearly. 6 months later, Steph was promoted to Regional Conservation Director. His first official act was to expand the anti-poaching patrols and increase penalties for illegal trapping. His second was to establish a wildlife rehabilitation program focused on treating injured predators in the field rather than transporting them to distant facilities. When asked why predators specifically, Steph would simply say, "Because they remember." He never told anyone about the wolf. Not the full story, anyway. How could he explain something that defied every scientific principle of animal behavior? How could he make them understand that a wild predator had chosen to save a human life, had remembered a debt across 6 months and countless kilometers, had refused to abandon that human even when every instinct said to flee? He couldn't. So he didn't try. But on winter nights, when Steph worked late at the station, he would sometimes step outside and listen to the forest. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, he would hear a distant howl carrying through the trees. He never howled back. Never tried to call the wolf closer or establish some kind of ongoing relationship. The wild wasn't meant to be tamed, wasn't meant to be made comfortable or domestic or safe. But he would stand there in the cold and listen, and he would remember amber eyes in the darkness, and he would understand that he'd been given a gift beyond price. The knowledge that compassion existed on both sides of the boundary between human and wild, and that sometimes, when it mattered most, that boundary disappeared entirely. The wolf had saved his life. But more than that, it had saved his understanding of what life could mean. Not just survival but connection. Not just existence, but the recognition that kindness, once given, creates ripples that spread farther than we can ever know. And in the wilderness of British Columbia, a grey wolf with a scarred shoulder and a notched ear continued its ancient patterns of hunting and surviving, carrying the memory of a human who had chosen mercy, who had been repaid with the same. The debt was paid. The bond remained. And the forest kept its secrets, as it always had, as it always would.
We appreciate you seeing the entire story. You will definitely enjoy the following story if you like this one. As you may imagine, it's more bizarre and fascinating. To view the next one, click on the image that is currently displayed on the screen,